I'll start with, well, hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for signing up to attend this session, The Evolution of Listening. We are very happy and at the same time honored with the kind of reception that we have received in terms of this whole thing surpassing our expectations. We've had over, I believe, almost 400 people, correct me if I'm mistaken here, sign up for this. Unfortunately, we only have spots for approximately 100 people. So those of you who missed this session, we are going to be recording this and we're going to make this available in our YouTube channel. So everyone will have a chance to actually watch this recording. So a little bit of a disclaimer before we start here. I thought it would be very good for me to let you know that if you came here looking for teaching activities, for listening and other top-down ideas for your classroom, you may be disappointed to know that this is not the main goal of this session. We're not here to give you activities you can use in your classroom tomorrow. For that, we designed the course, which we will talk about in a second. But we're more interested in the underlying principles of second language listening and perhaps even identifying some of the skills and sub-skills that are involved in second language listening. Having said that, I want to talk a little bit about the pre-sale of our course, Teaching Listening Made Easy. We have spent quite a lot of time doing research on this topic, and we basically ended up designing this course for practitioners, for teachers, teacher educators, language tutors, what have you. It's basically a very short course that shows you a different way of approaching listening, something that is appropriate for all ages, all levels, topics. It requires very minimal preparation. Of course, you still have to choose the text that you're going to use with your students, but we truly believe in this idea of transferability. We really think that things that we do in the classroom have to be transferable to any teaching context, from EAP to teaching the elderly. Also, it uses all the skills and systems in every lesson and will definitely make your students better and more independent learners. Again, if you have until the end of the day today, I think 48 hours, Andrew, correct me if I'm mistaken here.
Yeah, that's right.
48 hours to have early access to the course. Modules 1 and 2 are already uploaded and ready to go. You also get, as Mike said, 1 free month in our grassroots. It's our favorite new adjective, teacher membership. So
I'll find the link here and put it in the chat as well if you want.
Awesome. Yeah. So Andrew is going to put the link to the course. The course will deal with the activities. We wanted to talk a little bit more about the research, about the underlying principles, as I said earlier in the presentation. So this is what the course looks like. We're using an amazing platform. It's not Blackboard. It's not Desire to Learn. It's something called Thinkific, and it's highly intuitive as a platform. So we're very proud to actually be working with something that promotes not only asynchronous, but synchronous interaction for language teachers, educators, practitioners, and so on and so forth. So if you sign up today, as I said, you get a free listening lesson, and that is the English Mania, which is a lesson that we've designed together. You also get a copy of a listening assessment that you can use with your students, so to assess the kinds of problems that they might have with listening. And you also get a copy of our ebook on a listening journal. It's basically something that I've spent 6 months doing research on. We're very fond of podcasting. If you guys don't know, we have a podcast called Teacher Talking Time. And very recently, we had Jane Willis talking about task-based language teaching. And we had our counterpoint with Jason Anderson slamming everything that Jane Willis said. And we hope to create a culture of critical pedagogy for both teachers, practitioners, and everyone else involved in language education. All right. I'm rushing a little bit here. So if I'm going too fast, don't worry, because we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the session. In terms of aims and objectives, what do we hope to accomplish today? Well, we hope to show you basically how listening has evolved over the years. Okay, so we're going to take a trip, as I described in the session, a trip down memory lane to look at from the 1900s all the way to the 2000s, going through, you know, the Beatles, Britney Spears, all the way to NSYNC. We will also talk a little bit about the roles of listening in second language teaching, and more importantly, what is involved in effective and successful listening. And we hope that with this information, you should be able to have an overall grasp of what listening entails and even identify some of the skills that are involved in second language listening. So I will start with a little bit of a warmer here, which is something that was a research paper that I read recently, where they asked teachers to come up with metaphors for listening. So some people said listening is like life because without it you cannot live. I mean, questionable, but I would ask everyone to participate, because again, we are not here to just tell you how to do things or tell you things. We expect active participation. So perhaps on the chat box, if you could tell us your perception of listening. Listening is like what? Because, and give us a little reason for that. I won't be able to read the chats but I will rely on Mike or Andrew to read some of the responses here. Listening is like because.
Glenn says it's like a poem.
Ooh.
Because it can be interpreted in so many ways.
Okay, interpretation is important. We're going to come back and we're going to touch on that point. Okay. Any other ideas?
I know it's still morning in some places, and it's very late at night in some places, but we're very patient. We might speak quickly, but we're very patient people.
Oh, we've got some more coming in here. Margarita says listening is like breathing because it's a way of being alive.
Okay.
Mohammed says it's like life because you can hear what others say.
Okay.
And Jaime says listening is a group of sounds that create words and ideas that go to your brain. Very literal interpretation. Yes.
That's good, but that's a different, but again, the point I was trying to make is there will be some of these interpretations actually have evolved. The reason why we think about listening this way is because of the influence of technology, of trends and things like that. So without further ado, let's get started here with the views. So listening, the views of the role of listening in second language teaching have been changing, and they are changing, and it's increasingly being seen or being perceived as being more active rather than passive, a passive skill. And that's why we have Kanye there. And this idea of listening, of perhaps listening comprehension, can be addressed in two ways, both as a skill in its own right, which is what we call learning to listen, which is basically what Margarita, I think, said, with listening being sounds. That's kind of an example of learning to listen. Babies learn to listen. But then we can also look at listening as a means by which new language is processed and retained. And that's what Vandergrift opined as being listening as means, or listening to learn. And this is something that Krashen talked about in his comprehensible input. And this idea that what we do a lot in the classroom these days with listening is primarily used as a vehicle to teach grammar, to teach vocabulary, and to teach pronunciation, let's say. But the fact of the matter is there is a lot of emphasis on the listening to learn, but very little emphasis on the learning to listen. And that's the argument that has been put forward and has prompted us to create the Teaching Listening Made Easy course, because that's something that John Field has been writing extensively about, that Richard Caldwell has been talking a lot about. And unfortunately, Caldwell has retired, but his book, Phonology of Listening, is highly influential in the work that we do. So we will provide a list of references at the end of this session. So spoken language. So it's important for us to differentiate spoken language from written language. And according to Himes, spoken language and written language occur in different channels, or as he likes to say, different mediums, and they involve different psychological processes. So let's look at spoken language first. So because spoken language has to be processed, it has to be understood sequentially and also in real time, both by the speaker and the listener, which means that you as the listener, you usually get one go at understanding what has been said, and you don't often have the opportunity to go over the text again to check comprehension. Of course, this can change, but we'll get there. What about written language, Leo? Well, written discourse can be referred to many times. You can always reread a passage, whereas in listening, you don't have that. Not to mention the fact that written language is more grammatically complex. Written language is structurally complex. It's more elaborate as opposed to spoken language, which is short, simple, and most often sweet. Lexical density is another good example of this. Spoken English is less lexically dense. We use more pronouns. We have more repetition. We use more active verbs. There's also the idea of nominalization, which is very common in academic writing, in written language, with high levels of nominalization and very long noun phrases. We can't use long noun phrases in spoken English because we're building it bit by bit. And of course, we have other differences such as explicitness, the context, spontaneity, repetition, and so on and so forth. So, but that changes when we are talking about interactive situations where listeners will usually be able to ask their interlocutors to either repeat or rephrase, so they can to some extent tailor the input to their needs, okay? So that kind of helps. But that is to basically say that listening does require a complex set of skills. And some of these skills are actually, according to research, very similar to those required for reading. Okay. For example, a listener needs to recognize the topic of a conversation from the interlocutor's initial remarks. And then from there, he or she needs to be able to make predictions. So that's where the top-down is coming, about the kinds of developments of the topic to which he or she will have to respond. So this idea that we only use top-down, or that we only use bottom-up, I should say, is not really correct, because the idea is that we have an interactive mechanism where we have both the top-down and the bottom-up interacting simultaneously. Which brings us to the next part, which is this idea that, and I think somebody mentioned that when we were talking about the metaphors, is that listening also involves what we just said, the bottom-up, which is this whole set of acoustic skills that readers do not need. The spoken signals in English, in a conversation or in a listening activity, have to be identified from all the surrounding sounds and all this continuous stream of speech that has to then be segmented into units, and then those units have to be recognized as known words. And that is to say simply that listening is a topic which is relevant to all of us. And again, the fact that we had over 400 people signing up for this webinar shows us that the importance of listening in the second language classroom cannot be ignored any longer. And I think that's what led to the frustration with a lot of research, especially Caldwell. I've noticed a little bit, we wanted to have him on the podcast, but there was a lot of frustration with published materials still not understanding how we should be dealing with listening. Which brings us to very interesting research on listening. About 40 to 50% approximately of what we do is listening. 20 to 30% is speaking, and the rest reading and writing. In the classroom, as I said, most activities, whatever their ostensible purpose is, they rely to a greater or lesser extent on the learner's listening faculties, which is their natural ability to listen clearly. With that in mind, the fact is very simple. The fact that listening is relevant and prevalent in the second language classroom and in our day-to-day, it doesn't make it readily knowable. So even though there's a lot of research in the last couple of years on listening, we still don't know very much. And there was a quote by, I don't know if it was Michael Ross or if it was a different researcher, who said that the spoken language is the most sophisticated behavior of the most complex organism in the known universe. I think that quote alone just shows us how, I actually have it here. This is the quote. This just basically shows us how important and how little we actually know about listening. Even after decades of study, it is not surprising to note that we still know very little about listening. But
Leo,
what do we, yes.
Sorry, there was, just before you move on to the next, there was a quick question here. You cited some numbers earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Do those numbers include things like listening to TV while watching it? There was a question in the chat.
I can't quite recall. The numbers that were given in that specific paper were just overall numbers for listening. But I think that's the no average number, but I think those numbers can go higher, especially during COVID time now, because people are at home. But yeah. And again, so what do we know about listening? Well, I think what we know is that we may only be scratching the surface of a deep and fundamental process and the mechanism that really underpins our ability, as we said in the quote, that spoken language is the most sophisticated behavior, that underpins our ability to communicate with members of our own species. And this is really how we see listening, but this is what listening really is. Which brings us to the title of our session, The Evolution of Listening. So from now on, what we will do is we will look at how listening has evolved and how it has been portrayed based on evolutionary, technologically, and professional trends. So buckle up and away we go. So let's start with the 1900s. So what was happening in the 1900s? Well, a lot was happening. Again, I'm not going to go through all. This is not a history lesson. This is not the History Channel. But, we had a lot of interesting things. Introduction of typewriter, the assassination of the U.S. President McKinley. We had an earthquake in San Francisco. The construction of the Panama Canal. First wave of feminism started in the 1900s. But here's an interesting one. If you are in Canada, here's some trivia for you. Canada made the first audio radio broadcast to a general audience. That happened in the 1900s. But how does that influence listening, Leo? Well, that's the question. Lots of developments in recording technology. And that's when we started the introduction or the invention of acoustic phonetics. And then we had major breakthroughs in communication research. And that's when listening started being perceived as this recording of acoustic signals in the brain, which is what somebody said earlier in our session. And this recording of these signals in the brain that are going to be used later. Which brings us to the 1920s and the 30s, the decades between the wars. Again, the 20s, I really enjoyed doing this research. I'm back. Or the jazz age. And I keep being muted. Okay, I'm back. All right. Due to the economic boom following World War I. Okay, so what was happening in the world? Somebody has their microphone on and I can actually hear myself. If you are just joining us, please mute your microphone upon entering the room. So, what happened there? Well, a lot of things, destruction of barrels of alcohol to make alcohol illegal, all the way to Amelia Earhart, Hitler, the establishment of the Nazi Party, and the BBC, following suit with Canada, begins radio broadcasting. And again, this is the interesting thing because this is how it affects listening. We had a lot of research into the human psyche. And that's when Freud publishes his group psychology and the works on the analysis of the ego. And that's also when the works of Vygotsky and Piaget become popular. And based on that, listening then is defined as this unconscious process, which is controlled by mysterious cognitive mechanisms, which again were later recognized and and coined as top down and bottom up. But it's interesting to note how basically it was this idea of Freud publishing something about the ego that really made listening this unconscious thing. Sometimes you were listening to your own ego. Anyway, I still hear some background noise there. If you have your microphone on, please. But that's okay. Let's get to the 1940s. So here what we have is the consequences of the war, which again, we're lingering into the second half of the decade. We have the, I think it was the beginning of the Cold War here in preparation for a post-World War II economic expansion. But what was happening in terms of technology and how does that influence listening? Well, we had lots of advances in telecommunications, a lot of information processing. And again, we had the invention of the telephone switchboard and the invention of the transistor, which is this little device that is used to amplify or switch electronic signals. And that also affected our perception, our definition of listening, because then listening was defined as a successful transmission. Again, following what I just said about the 40s, this amplifying electronic signals. So it was also seen as the recreation of messages. It's interesting to see how, as we evolve as a planet, as a society, as one, we start seeing how a lot of these things are actually affecting the way you perceive listening. I think that was by far one of the most fascinating aspects of this research. So we're getting to the 50s. So the world is recovering from World War II. We have the Cold War. We have a lot of competition between the US and the Soviet Union. And more importantly, lots of clashes between the communists and the capitalists. So yeah, Leo, that's not important. What do I want to know is, how does this relate to listening? Well, this is an interesting part because there were a lot of developments in computational science, and these had a very important influence on something called cognitive psychology, which is, again, cognitive comes from the Latin cognoscere. I don't know if my Italian is very good, but cognoscere means to know. So basically, cognitive psychology was basically studying our mental abilities to perceive, to learn, to remember, to think, to reason, and to understand. And cognitive psychology became so important in the mid-50s because there was this dissatisfaction with something that we recognize here, language teachers, language educators, as behaviorism, which was this simple emphasis on the external behavior rather than what was actually happening inside the machinery in our brains. And this lack of understanding of these internal processes in the brain led to no distinction between memory and performance. And a lot of this failed to account for the complexity of learning. And that's when Chomsky started criticizing behaviorism, and therefore we have the cognitive revolution. And how did this affect listening? Well, listening became, actually, let me say this, listening was defined more in terms of dissecting or tagging all the input that we received so that input could be stored and then retrieved more efficiently. And that's where we learned those three terms: sensory memory storage, which is what holds sensory information; short-term memory storage, which is holds information for a short period of time for analysis and then retrieves information from the long-term memory. And then that's where we also have the term long-term memory, which again holds information for a longer period of time, which receives information from the short-term memory. We're almost there. We're getting to the 60s now. All right. What was happening in the 60s apart from, it was a decade of culture, or a cultural decade. I think the biggest thing that happened in the 60s was JFK assassination and this creation of a counterculture. There was a revolution of social norms. And this is going to affect how we perceive listening in a second. And this revolution could be perceived in clothing, music, drugs, dress, even sexuality to a certain extent. And that's where we started seeing the rise of transpersonal psychology. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but transpersonal psychology is this idea or this notion that everything is centered on spiritual aspects of human life, and everything transcends or transcendent aspects of the human experience. And that's where we have the works of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a fascinating book called Man's Search for Meaning, which is not an ELT book, but if you're interested in understanding meaning in life, I strongly recommend that. And Maslow, the hierarchy of needs, which, by the way, here's a little curious fact. I can provide the link later, but I just came across some research from someone who said that Maslow actually never designed the pyramid, and there was not a hierarchy. So this was something that somebody probably, I don't remember exactly what the words were, but somebody took his ideas and then created this pyramid and basically created the hierarchy of needs. And I think the same applies to, what's the guy who does the taxonomy? What's his name? With B?
Bloom, Leo Bloom.
Bloom, yes. Apparently Bloom is the same similar example of this, but I will remind me to provide you with the link at the end of our session today. And interestingly, listening as defined by the heuristics, again, the people who use their experiences to find answers to question and improve performance, for them, listening was understanding the inner worlds of both the speaker and the listener. And that's when we kind of start seeing listening as this relationship between speaker and listening. Before that, it was just very unidirectional, right? Which brings us to my favorite decade, the 70s, even though I was an 80s boy. Again, lots of changes, socially progressive values are growing. And that's when we started having this renewed interest in globalism, which is this idea that countries should actually consider the whole world when they're taking action. Again, that's when the term butterfly effect was first coined. You know, one event in one part of the world will affect other parts of the world. And of course, anthropology became gained some prominence in the 70s, which again, this renewed interest in globalism and space exploration led to the creation of natural language processing. And Chomsky added the last nail to the coffin of behaviorism with the revolution in cognitive science. But Leo, how does this affect? It's interesting because I said globalism, right? This idea of us as one. That is interesting because this is something that I discovered recently doing this research, is that that's where listening, this definition, I should say, of cultural schemata became popular, right? In psychology and in cognitive science, a schema describes this pattern of thought or behavior that organizes all these categories of informations and relationships among them. But all of that comes from, again, the revolution in cognitive science, the end of behaviorism, and this interest in globalism. So I think that kind of played a role in how we perceive listening. Which brings us to the 80s. Oh, what a decade. Advances in technology, and then we started having this worldwide move away from planned economies and towards a more laissez-faire capitalism. We had the AIDS epidemic back in the day, and that's when global warming became a topic of interest. But interestingly, that's also, which again, this is going to have a tremendous impact on how we perceive listening. That's when we have this growing interest in organizational behavior. For those of you who don't know what organizational behavior is, it's basically the study of human behavior in companies, in organizational settings. And this gives people insights on how employees behave and how they perform in the workplace. And this kind of helps us develop an understanding of the aspects that can motivate employees, that can increase their performance, and of course, help organizations establish a strong and trusting relationship with their employees. But Leo, how does that affect listening? Hear me out. That's when listening started becoming defined as people skills, right? Oh, he's such a good listener. He has people skills. And of course, all the conscious decisions a person made to be an active listener. So this is where this idea of active listening started gaining more prominence, which brings us, we're almost there, to the 90s. And again, the rise of multiculturalism, Kurt Cobain, Bill Clinton, death of Tupac and Biggie. Extreme advances in technology with, again, the invention of, I don't know how many of you here remember this, but that's when the WW, the World Wide Web, became very popular. I recently watched a documentary on Netflix called History 101, and they were talking about DNAs. That was the first gene therapy trial. Bonus points for those who remember the name of the sheep. You can type it on the chat there and tell us. And also the first Dolly, good. You get extra points. You get brownies after this. And the first designer baby. So I strongly recommend watching that documentary on Netflix, History 101. Okay, Leo, this is all nice, but how does this affect listening? Well, that's when we had the emergence of digital technology, the popularization of personal computers, cell phones. Also, bonus points for those of you who know what a Discman is. Breakthroughs in computer technology, and this is the part that is interesting to all of us, dealing with vast quantities of data. And that it will affect our definition of listening. But how, Leo? That's because listening was defined as the processing of input. And I think that's what led, and again, I will have to interview Krashen, because I really want to know how he came up with the notion of comprehensible input. So stay tuned. We might have Krashen on the Teacher Talking Time podcast. Which brings us to Britney Spears, Miley Cyrus, and Backstreet Boys. What do we have in common here? No, I don't know, to be honest. But this is where we had the breakthrough of the economic giant China, the global financial crisis, which sparked a global recession, which pretty much is going to happen now with us, with the coronavirus, and the growth of the internet. And this is the important part, because this is what relates to language teaching and language education, the emergence of digital networking and social media. Oops. All right, we're getting there. So listening then was defined as this idea of keeping multiple events, Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, WhatsApp, Instagram, and people in one's accessibility network. So we all have these different networking platforms that we can use to connect with each other quickly and more efficiently. But then Julian Treasure argues something different, but I will get to that in a second. So we're reaching the half mark here. I'm going to take a 10-second break. Please stretch your legs, stretch your arms. I've been reading a lot about the importance of self-care. I don't really do a lot of self-care, to be honest, but I would love to stretch my legs for 10 seconds, if that's okay.
Leo, it's pretty funny. I think we're kind of discovering in the chat that as you go through these decades, we're finding out that you're revealing our ages, right? Like
yes.
as you kind of connect to each one of these topics, you're showing your age. You're like, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Which is totally fine.
That's
with
fine.
age
There's
comes
nothing
wisdom.
wrong with that.
Yeah. And
this is
experience.
interesting. That's very interesting. Well, that is to say, Mike, that all in everyone here, that these shifts, they reflect changes in our expectations of what we are able to do and achieve through listening, which brings us to something very important. As we evolve as a species, our definitions, our interpretations of listening and of communication in general will continue to change, especially now with TikTok. And this will reflect our evolution, our worldview, our expectations of what breakthroughs in science will enable us to do. And this is why now I think bottom up is gaining more prominence, because things are changing. Which brings us to our perspectives on listening, because as I said in the beginning, this transient, invisible nature of listening processes, we need better analogies, we need better metaphors, better correlations to describe listening. And one of my favorite listening researchers, Michael Rost, he actually provided 4 very interesting descriptions, which are very much consistent with our current perspectives of listening. So there's going to be active participation from you in a second. One common metaphor that I have been hearing a lot, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of, I think her name is Janet Littlemore, and she's written extensively on cognitive linguistics, and she talks a lot about metaphorical language. And I couldn't help but think that in listening, we normally, even the language that we use when we listen is so metaphorically, in that when we say something like, oh, I didn't catch your name, it's funny how for us listening means catching what someone says. It's this idea that you can actually hold the words. Very interesting, very interesting. We also have this transaction illusion, right? That listening is a type of negotiation for information, or some sort of, or some desirable outcome. There's always something that you want to get out of a listening transaction. And then the last one, this is I came across on the Harvard Business Review more recently, which is listening is a trampoline. And this is interesting because our tendency, and this is something that I've noticed because my mother used to say that, you know, being a good listener means being a sponge, you know, absorbing as much information as possible. But what the research from the Harvard Business Review suggests is that that's not really the best analogy. They basically looked at data, and they analyzed a number of listening traits. And what the researchers found is that being a good listener is about the type of feedback that is offered than it is just quietly listening, which is the Kanye metaphor. So for them, a good listener is someone that you can bounce ideas off of. And rather than absorbing your ideas and your energy, they kind of amplify, they energize, and they clarify your thinking. They make you feel better. And they're not just basically absorbing information, but they're actively supporting. And this gives you energy. It gives you height, just like someone jumping on a trampoline. So this is an interesting metaphor, which brings us to a task. Now you guys are going to do the work, and I am going to not really take a break, but just rest for a little bit. So we're going to look at Michael Rost's 4 perspectives on listening. For each perspective, I want you to, if you have a notebook, if you have a piece of paper, or you can even type on the chat, for each perspective, I really want you to think about what specific listening skills might be required. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here. So when I mention the first perspective, what specific listening skills do you think might be required for each of them? Okay? So here we go. Let's look at the first one. The first one is a receptive perspective, and it basically means receiving what the speaker actually says. So maybe write down 1 or 2 ideas. What is involved? What kind of listening skills might be required for you to receive what the speaker actually says? I'll give you 10 seconds.
Do you want me to read some out?
You can.
Comprehension skills, good hearing.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, some more people are typing, so we're just waiting.
Okay.
They're classifying sounds.
I like that. I like that.
There's also Regina saying knowledge of the topic. There might be an awareness of bias.
Oh God, we have a great audience here.
I see decoding of sounds here.
Yes.
Well, I
yes.
think decoding is also just,
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
beautiful.
Okay. Let's go to the second one then. The second one is the constructive perspective. And again, the constructive perspective sees listening as constructing and representing meaning. So when we think about this, listening as a constructive activity where we are constructing, building, and representing this meaning, what specific listening skills might be required here? There might be an overlap, just so you know. But what else, how different do you think it would be in comparison to the first perspective, the receptive one?
So see here, linking ideas, turn taking, Eric says. See, organizing ideas or sounds. Pressy thinks that accent might play a role here. Portia says,
oh, I like that.
Formulating a response.
Okay.
I like that. That's interesting. Connecting prior knowledge.
Ooh, Danny. Okay. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah, these are great.
So let's look at the third perspective. The collaborative one. And here, according to Michael Rost, listening is being perceived as negotiating meaning with the speaker and responding. So we're moving away from a receptive, where we're just receiving what is being said, to a constructive, where we are building and representing the meaning, to a collaborative, where we are negotiating meaning. And this, again, we're going back to Michael Long's interaction hypothesis, where for him, language can only be acquired through interaction. Not only, language is better acquired, we should say. I have to be very careful with my words. I got in trouble recently because of that. But yes, negotiating meaning with the speaker and respondent. So what specific listening skills might be required here?
So Ramife says evaluative listening. Rosemary saying criticizing. Glenn saying
I love that.
Negotiating a common meaning. Danny says using cultural knowledge. Amaloa has said a couple times context in their earlier contributions as well. A sense of humor as well.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot.
Rephrasing and inferring meaning. Compromise, Leo, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, because when you compromise, you have to collaborate, right?
Yeah, you're empathizing, otherizing, right?
Yes, otherizing, yes.
Cultural background, so that's another culturals coming up. Building meaning.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. So the last perspective is the transformative perspective, in which listening is being defined as creating meaning through involvement, imagination, and empathy. Okay, so we go from receptive to constructive to collaborating, or to collaborative, I should say, to transforming. So when we think about this one, what specific listening skills might be required here?
So right away, I see critical thinking and meaning making, improvement, openness, Eric suggests, which is quite interesting.
Like
drawing on past experience, Glenn says. Pressy says applying. Amaloa says empathy.
Okay.
Luis says opinions. Pamela says whole structure. Whole structure, maybe.
Okay.
And Mary says higher order thinking skills. Yeah.
It's interesting to see how we have different ideas. And again, but I think a lot of them will overlap. Okay. And I think this is important to bear in mind. And a lot of the other interesting thing to me is that a lot of this comes from Socratic thinking, from Socratic questioning. I've been doing a lot of research on Socrates' Socratic method. And I find that a lot of what Socrates was doing in terms of not only listening, but it was a lot of questioning. But I find that there are a lot of similarities between this idea of receiving, constructing, collaborating, and transforming. So listening really is a holistic activity. So for us to say that listening is a passive skill, as Kanye suggests in the beginning of the session, I think it would be it wouldn't be a fair description. So
sorry, Leo.
Yeah,
Leo, just a quick question here. Are you synonymizing Socratic method with dialectical method?
I'm not familiar with the dialectal method because all my reading so far has been biographies of Socrates and looking at the Socratic method that he used back in Athens with a lot of his students and pupils. So I have to do some more reading into dialectal method. But please send me an email because I would love to hear more about that as well. And I've already written it down because I want to follow up on that. But a good point. Good point. I want to see that.
Thank you.
I have a list of. I have some resources that we can talk about later with regards to that. So let's just jump and talk a little bit about these 4 perspectives. And again, trying to understand what specific listening skills are required. So when we look at perspective number 1, which is receptive, the listening skills that are emphasized in this perspective, they relate, and again, some of you said this, to the mechanics of listening itself, which are sometimes referred to as bottom-up skills. And these include things like decoding, harvesting, and I like that, harvesting what is in the speaker's mind, receiving the transfer of images, impressions, thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, and so on and so forth. Hearing prominent words, like stressed words, identifying parts of speech. This is something that John Field talks a lot about in his book, which I have here, Listening in the Language Classroom, and deciding on the meaning of ambiguous utterances, and of course, understanding the meaning of intonation patterns. Of course, there's also, and I would argue here, the selective process of attending to or hear or understanding and remembering certain sounds as well. When we look at the second perspective, the constructive, this one, I went too far. It emphasizes, again, a lot of you said this in your comments, and this is great that we're all on the same page here. It emphasizes this active role that the listener plays in really trying to understand the information that is being conveyed. It involves, I would argue, and Rost argues that it involves a lot of the skills that we use in receptive perspective, but also it involves reframing, right? This idea of rephrasing what the speaker's message is in a way that is relevant to you. What else do we have here? Understanding the speaker's intended function, right? Why this person is actually talking to you. What do they want, right? What else? I'm having problems with, okay, here. Filling in the gaps, right? Filling in missing information. Guessing the meaning of unknown words. Again, something that I read recently, which is very interesting about guessing meaning. Guessing meaning of unknown words, both in reading and listening, should be considered, in my opinion, I'm going to make this very clear, in my opinion, a compensatory strategy. It's not a strategy that you can use to learn new words, but it's a strategy that you can use to compensate for the lack of syntactical or schematic knowledge. And of course, making inferences, noticing what is not said was what we call reading between the lines, or in this case, listening between the lines, I guess. Making predictions, and I think somebody said this, predictions about what the speaker is going to say next. And one thing that is not here, but it's this idea that oral language is received critically and purposefully attended to. We recognize all the signals in terms of our past experiences and our future expectancies. So there is a little bit of the schema activation, but there's also a little bit of the prediction of what's going to be coming next. Which brings us to the third perspective, which is the collaborative, which is this idea of negotiation of meaning and responding. And in this perspective, the role of the listener changes because, as many of you have said, the listener is providing feedback. And this feedback can be either orally or through their body language. So you know when that person is actually listening to you. And this will allow the conversation to either continue or be interrupted. And again, it involves a lot of the things that we saw in the second perspective, which is the constructive, and the first one, which is the receptive. But it builds on that by adding that we choose, again, along with the speaker, a code. We choose a context. Those of you who are not members, one of the things that we had in our membership in June is we talked a lot about alignment. And I think this collaborative perspective aligns with the theory of alignment. Because normally, how do we align with another person? We align lexically. Again, we are using the same words. We align phonologically by pronouncing words in a similar way. And also we could align syntactically by using the same grammatical structure. So I think there are a lot of interesting parallels here. And I'm always trying to bring this back to things that we have already talked about in our membership with our members. Also involves responding to what the speaker says, also negotiating information or even values with the speaker. And this is the interesting one, because this is where we had this idea of using verbal and nonverbal cues when we're having a conversation, when we're listening. So we have to act like we're interested by saying, okay, oh, really, I see. So we have a lot of this here in the collaborative, making eye contact, things like that. Listening appropriately and providing appropriate feedback, what's clear, what's not clear, repairing breakdowns in communication. And of course, sharing the emotional climate of the speaker. I find this very interesting. And of course, the acquisition, the processing, and the retention of information in that very specific context. So we're getting to the end here. First perspective we looked at was receptive. Again, what we refer to as bottom up. In the second one, we looked at the constructive, which is this active role that we play as listeners in trying to understand the information that is being conveyed. In the third one, we collaborate with negotiation of meaning, responding, giving feedback to our interlocutor. And in the fourth one, the transformative, it's interesting because to me, that's when I think about this, is creating meaning. Many of you said this when we were talking about your ideas. It's involvement, it's imagination. And now there's a movement in psychology of, I think it's called emphatic listening. So if you want to do some research at the end of this session, I've become very interested in this notion of emphatic listening. It's something that I definitely want to be teaching to my students. So this perspective emphasizes the learning element of listening, both in terms of acquiring new information, acquiring information about the target language itself. So we have both here. So we have listening to learn, and we're coming back full circle here in learning to listen. So on top of that, we also have this ability of being involved with the speaker. And some of you said this, no judgment, right? Creating this connection with the speaker or with the listener, or being empathetic with the person. And the alignment that I mentioned earlier today, seeking this synchronicity with the speaker and creating meaning and filling in the gaps, completing the communication process. And I really like this, feeling the flow of consciousness as you pay attention to things, because really listening is not passive. And what else do we have here? Oh, and of course, storing relevant information from the exchange that we've had in the long-term memory. And that's what we have in terms of listening. But I wasn't satisfied yet, so I wanted to do more. So I thought, what are some acronyms that we have for listening? And upon doing some research, I found that there are very interesting acronyms that institutions, companies use to describe listening. And the first one I found very interesting is EARS, which means eye contact, which again is the collaborative perspective, acknowledging that you are listening. And how do we do this? Asking open-ended questions, nodding, saying, asking questions, reflecting feelings. Oh, right. It sounds as if you're feeling, or you felt like, oh, this is how you felt when this was said. And saying in your own words what you heard the person say, and then confirm. So what you're saying is blah, blah, blah. Is that right? So that's the first acronym that I came across. The second one, another interesting one. They're all related to listening. The next one is listen. So when you listen, you look interested, you involve yourself by responding. Again, go back to those 4 perspectives, okay? Think about them. It also means the S here stands for staying on target. Again, in line with Grice's maxims. The T stands for testing your understanding. The E, evaluating the message. And the N is the emphatic aspect of listening, neutralizing your feelings. And of course, if you are not familiar with this man, Julian Treasure has a fascinating TED Talk. And I think, I can't remember the name of the TED Talk now. I don't remember the name. If you Google it, can someone Google that for me and find out the name of the TED Talk? And he always says at the beginning, we are losing our listening. I only remember that part.
5 ways to listen better. That's it.
5 ways. Thank you, Andrew. 5 ways to listen better.
It's
a great TED Talk. It's a good one, right?
I use it with my class all the time.
Oh, that's great. It's a good one to actually, we might design a lesson plan on this one. But Julian Treasure comes up with his own acronym. He says that effective listeners use RASA, which stands for receiving, paying attention to the message, appreciating, making a sound, smiling, nodding, summarizing. So are you saying that, is that what you're trying to say? And ask, how can I follow this? So for him, Rasa means the divine nectar or the taste of enlightenment. Which brings us, unfortunately, to the end of our webinar. And for the first time, we're actually sticking to the time. I thought this webinar would last 5 hours, but I'm glad we're getting to the end now. I hope you're enjoying it so far. So my final thoughts are related to the way we're dealing with listening in the classroom. If you haven't purchased the course, or if you are actually teaching, I have a few words of advice here, things that we could do in the classroom. I think the first one is there should be a movement from always adopting, in the classroom, there's this movement from always adopting high-risk strategies, like assuming that understanding is correct without checking if it is. This is something that we do a lot in the classroom, and we have to move away from that to adopting a more low-risk strategy, but actually assuming that just because our students got the answer right, we need to understand that this needs to be checked, of course, when appropriate. Also, this idea of treating listening with the same risk orientation. So we have to move away from treating listening tasks with the same risk orientation, high or low, to adopting a more flexible orientation, depending, of course, on the purpose. If we're asking our students to listen to something for the first time, it should be low risk. But if we're asking our students to decode, then it should be high risk. So we should be very flexible in how we approach listening in the classroom. Another one, again, this is moving away from an extrinsic orientation to listening, which is following the procedures of the task only, to more a personal orientation to the task, which is, what are your personal goals when you are listening? I think every student is at a different stage in the listening process in their lives. So I think we should be asking our students to do a lot more extensive listening, because extensive listening, we can cater to their own personal goals. And that's the goal of our 30-page ebook, our listening journal, is to really move away from this extrinsic to a more personal orientation. And this is a good one too, because I've been teaching a group of Japanese students, and I don't really believe that my students need to know the IPA. That's my personal view. I don't expect my students to write phonetically. So for me, we should move away from requiring this clear phonetic representation of utterances. Also, and by clear phonetic representations of utterances here, what I mean is we can't expect our students to write down exactly the same word that they heard. We should accept ambiguity. And what do I mean by that? I had a student recently who heard in a listening conversation that we were doing in class, she heard sudden interior lifestyle, But the way she wrote that, I'm actually going to write it here so everyone can see. She wrote sedentary lifestyle. And I accepted that. I accepted that. Why? Because that's the representation of the sounds that she heard. And of course, I told her, let's look at the context here. Does it make sense in this context? And she said, no. I said, let's keep listening. Eventually, she got to this. So that's what I mean by accepting more ambiguity and constructing plausible, because to me, this is a plausible phonetic representation of this. And of course, after we do this, we can deal with it in more depth. And of course, moving away from identifying general non-understandings, like students who say, I don't understand anything, to understanding the sources of the non-understanding. So when a student says he doesn't understand something, let's try to find out why. Is it because he or she doesn't know the words? Because what we've seen is that 25%, I think it's the research by field, 25% of B1 students are not able to recognize known words. That is to say that they listen to something and then you give them that extract, and in that extract, they have lots of words that they know, but they are unable to understand. So I think that's what we should be doing. Moving away from I don't understand anything to, okay, so why didn't you understand anything? Let's try to find out the sources, because then you have something to work with. And again, moving away from listening success as being the responsibility of the hearer to a more collaborative. And this applies to English as a lingua franca, because a lot of people still emphasize this idea that non-native speakers should sound like native speakers, and native speakers have to be able to understand. I think that we should collaborate, again, just based on this notion that we are all together speaking English as a lingua franca. And of course, the last one here, moving away from trying to understand all the discourse to actually postponing some aspects of this non-understanding for later clarification. So identify within the lesson, within an interaction where there was known understanding, and then you can use that later in the classroom with your students to actually clarify, maybe do some sort of decoding activity with them. So we're getting to the end here. I really hope that these definitions, that these groupings have given you an overall idea of what listening entails. Some of these may or may not resonate with you, while others may make very little sense to you. We understand this, but we really hope that this webinar has shown you that there are a wide range of perspectives about listening, and that we still, up until this day, we still know very little about the science behind listening. And this is all part of the research that went into finding out more about the definitions and the process of listening, which again are, in my opinion, they're complete, they're inclusive, and I think a lot of them will serve our teaching purposes. Which brings us to the last part, which is silent writing time. So I want everyone to take a minute to think about these three questions that I have for you. The first one, what are my top takeaways? Number two, what am I going to do with this information? And number three, what questions do I still have about this topic? 30 seconds for you, because I think we don't do this often enough in the classroom. We don't do this often enough in sessions. But I think taking time to reflect and think about, what did I get from this session? What am I going to do with this information? And do I still have any questions about this? I think this will help us get closer to what I had said in this webinar about not just you guys receiving information, but also us constructing, collaborating together, and more importantly, transforming the way we teach listening in the classroom. Thank you very much. Let's go to the next slide here. All right. If you stuck around, I'm going to let Mike and Andrew take over now. I need to take a break. I'm tired of talking. Mike or Andrew, you want to take over and talk a little bit about the course, the Teaching Listening Made Easy course, and the offer that we have for those who stuck around with us?
Yeah, so for those of
You're muted. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I'm all thumbs right now. I'm so excited after that webinar. All right, everyone. Yeah, so as many of you know, that we had the pre-sale for our course, and we've had a great response so far. And we're really trying to now go from the theory and look at the practice of sound pedagogical approaches to teaching. And a lot of what is in the course is very much the how of what Leo just talked about. And what you can get from this course is not only the actual course itself, but you're going to get some perks. So you're going to get early access to the content. So we're going to drip the content to the pre-sale people. And not only that, you are still able to get free access to the membership, which is really what we feel is going to lead to genuine growth. Because as Leo has pointed out a couple times, it's working together, either looking at the podcast content or the webinar that we have chosen for that specific month, together and doing it in a way in which we can share ideas about classroom practice. And you are still going to be able to get that for the same price. That is the 40% discount. Leo, do you want to talk a little bit about your references there?
Well, I just want to say thank you. And a lot of the work that went into the ebook, especially the listening journal thing, has come from the works of Benson, who does a lot of work with agency, Bialystok with communication strategies, Michael Rost, and of course, I forgot to include, but I didn't include him much on this webinar, but the work of John Field and Richard Caldwell. I didn't use them as references, but they're definitely part of my active bibliography, and a lot of their work have influenced the design of our Teaching Listening Made Easy course. And as Mike said, we think it's a great course. We've designed this course with practitioners in mind, with language tutors, people who are tired of just testing listening, are tired of just practicing listening, and really want to look at listening from a different perspective, look at listening from a transformative, from a collaborative, from a constructive, and also from a receptive way. And we find that the course really encompasses all of these four perspectives, and it includes pretty much everything that we have talked about here. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions before we end this. If anyone has any questions.
And I also think sorry, Leo, but I also think it's quite nice that we're seeing people from not only North America. So so if you are outside of North America and you'd like to get to know us a little more, then please contact us. You can contact us at info@learnyourenglish.com.
Yes, good point.
We've done webinars for organizations in Brazil, Mexico, but also in terms of Europe. We've been heavily involved with working with some organizations there. In Asia, where we're starting to develop partners as well. So we just would like to expand our network with like-minded individuals who are passionate about this kind of combination of personal, practical knowledge, theory, and research. And that's essentially our goal, is to kind of create this scholar practitioner mindset in the teaching community. And we do feel that is very much a teacher-led process. We are all teachers. and we really feel that as Leo said, it's a very big tent. So you don't need to consider yourself to be a teacher. You could be a tutor. You could be a volunteer at the library, helping new Canadians or people who are trying to learn English as a means of enabling their future and improving their lives. So please, we would love to have you join the membership. We'd love to have you check out the course, and we'd like to be part of your professional development journey.
Absolutely. That's it. Thank you everyone for attending. If you have any questions, you can, we have 2 minutes left here, but you can type questions on the chat box. We will be in touch. We'll send you an email, a follow-up to this. Those of you who couldn't attend, we have recorded this webinar, and I think we can actually stop recording it now.